more than 10.
I've gotten to the point on Slack where I leave everything white.
I just do shift escape because that everything is set.
I've got everything muted.
Really?
Yes.
Man, that is fucking wicked useful, dude. You just made my day.
And I use it for the Elixir channel because I just don't really read the Elixir stuff.
What's up, girl?
But there's in the Ruby Together team, they're competing
There's
who
like a
has
few.
the most.
There's also water.
Someone got onto 32.
The Capital Factory. They did what?
I'm gonna go out.
In the Ruby Together team Slack, they're competing who has the most.
Do you want an AirPlay or do you want to just hook up?
Oh, wow. And someone has
most people use
32
AirPlay.
Slack.
Alerted.
I don't trust this wireless stuff.
You're presenting, right? By the way, I feel like I met you before and I forgot your name because I'm Youssef.
Like this side of the room.
No, so what was happening was when he
You can put it like yourself.
tried to answer the first one.
I saw you airplane earlier. Are you on the Wi-Fi?
Yes, it's the Castle Factory Wi-Fi.
Okay.
Delete what he had here.
Michelle, did you figure out what the password was?
They gave me a card, there's a card S.
Keep Austin all lowercase. no
Usually it
spaces.
just connects.
That's all good passwords.
All one word, all lowercase.
They changed it a couple weeks ago.
Password 1, 2, 3.
Wow, I'm using Cambridge Square's Wi-Fi.
Well, I'm used to now.
So,
Well, I guess I didn't make more, unless my profile saved, but I used to be able to just main capital factory without the
I
S.
walked in and it connected to
So,
it's
you're in?
I don't have that anymore, I'm
They
sure.
hacked the network.
It's keep Austin hacking.
that's
Is
fine.
the password.
so I tried.
All lowercase, all one word.
I tried to connect my Raspberry Pi to my home Wi-Fi and it couldn't handle special characters and stuff like that. So I had to change. So I had to put two Wi-Fi's, one on my AirPlay and one on my Google On, and then have
Well, there
one
are
be like
duplicate answers because you can't answer duplicates.
because my Raspberry Pi couldn't handle. I tried for 2 hours. Like, why is this not connecting? I'm doing this right. I'm absolutely sure that this is right. And then I changed. I did a test the network, guest network, and put the password just lowercase letters, and it worked. Oh, my 30 characters, special characters, ends and as and names and whatever. Couldn't handle the Raspberry Pi. Couldn't handle.
Like encoding or something? The mic? Yeah.
So I've got the ceiling mic turned on.
Oh, okay.
I heard that we were like,
Well,
and,
I love that they have that monitor there.
but we actually have this.
Yeah, all of them.
So you're gonna take the mic and present down here while I pantomime. Is that what we're doing?
Yes.
That would be
Precisely.
It's like a review of project.
For each talk, we'll just have like a volunteer.
Yes.
The hard to do this in St. Louis, or you only do
You do this in like everywhere. This talk has been crazy accepted.
I should take mine slightly revised version.
And most of the time you find is they're always like.
Go compete against him head to head.
Who does it better?
Is it from facepalm to facepalm? From foolproof to foolproof?
How to unscrew up and rescrew up your application?
Oh. As a war story, I really think, and it is a good lesson learned. Also would make a good blog post. Also, a shit ton of people need to learn about it. Using integer instead of big integer for a primary key.
Yes.
That actually happened to me.
Nice.
Yeah.
We have, yeah, I've it's
Internally.
various apps go, crap.
Cheers, always my turn.
Deal with this.
By the way, I remember Richard just getting.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well.
Now
or never.
I keep forgetting that at one point you and I Heroku support. About a year ago, we didn't know each other at that point, but I was. I don't know, maybe I did, but I was like, because your picture on Heroku has nothing to do with how you're honestly. So I did not recognize you at first.
You're not speaking, right?
No, I'm not. I'm MCing though.
Of course.
So hope you like hip hop with a little bit of trip hop.
I'm gonna freestyle rapping for an hour.
Oh, this is great.
His picture looks like his GitHub picture, so the black and white.
He's talking about it's Facepalm and Foolproof. So basically, like common things that people do like wrong and like how to
In relation to Heroku?
fix them. Just like general.
Rails in general.
I thought you said in relationships, and then you added Heroku.
Oh,
I'm
no.
like,
And then
Time for relationship.
and then CLIs, some Rake, a little bit of Thor. I think Thor's biggest mistake was making run an internal command.
On the
Because otherwise, it would be like bundle run.
that would just be the default verb.
So like run means something inside of Thor. It's like an internally like reserved thing. I think that was their biggest mistake. Feel free to use that.
Oh, like, you mean like that reminds me of, I want to say it was an old version of the very Stripe API. Bring up and work that.
Yes.
if you don't
We're
really
loyal
do-
to each other, but
if you
that's
don't,
about it.
I mean, your method names are your tasks.
Yeah.
So you never call something on a run for that.
Well, I mean,
What's the premise?
for example, I have like if you have a task that like runs other things. So I actually have like derailed benchmarks. Actually, just started out with like the rate tasks. And then I was like, oh crap! Now I need like some meta thing, like a little CLI wrapper. And so inside of it, you ended up like it's kind of weird. Like you end up wanting to like call other tasks. So exactly like bundling. Like you want to call like bundle exec and then some arbitrary thing. But it's like it would be kind of convenient if it was like bundle run, like with 2 less characters, right?
Of course, it's like what I do sometimes with my API. I was like, it says something that doesn't make it. I name the method call or.
By the way, I can't do math. It's only one letter.
Yeah, just sort
We've all believed you though. I was trying to remember what gem, there's a gem I used recently that, it was essentially just supposed to be like a thin wrapper around an API.
I did it for a while. It's
The verb they chose
like
to use
good, like especially
was
if you have
call
an idea.
or something like that, where it's like, oh, you accidentally overrode a fundamental, prepay. Maybe, it might have been possible.
I've definitely done like email things, and accidentally overrode send.
Yeah. No, that's what it was. It was send or send. That's how you send emails. And they're like, we really screwed this up. We're coming out with a new version of the gem very soon because probably shouldn't override send. It's not a great thing to. Yeah.
How did that work in their tests?
It would not use the gem in any other context of exactly what they had tested.
Yeah, they probably weren't
Failed spectacularly.
using send.
I love all your Facebook pictures because this works on paper. It's like, look where I am. No problem, my friend.
I have a man of the hour
Peace.
of the afternoon. So yesterday you were on.
2 weeks ago, but we just got those pictures.
Okay.
The other thing is, like, it was cooler than I expected, but also way harder. But somebody else took those photos, not obviously everybody just sent them. And I've not gotten them from him when we got to the bottom of the mountain. We were just exhausted and forgot. Went back to sitting.
Also, what's the word that
Email him, tried to get him to send them to us. My buddy was like, dude, I got the longer and I somebody I can use this. He sent that up.
Would have been awkward. Just sometimes you get this stuff in my rotation. I'm like, I was like, I didn't realize you just like, okay, I was my day, said it's hard. I haven't seen any of this.
Yeah,
But it was, I mean, it was represented awesome.
So that was one of the biggest.
The way it's phrased, it was harder than I expected. It was one of those things, when we got down, I was like, man, more than enough. But now I'm kind of like, thinking I might be interested, just to, I mean, I know what I'm to expect now. I just didn't expect quite that.
She never will. She will probably in season 2.
weather.
Well, normally we actually start at 7:05.
Am I lying? That's such a deep conversation. Also, am I lying?
Yeah, the weather doesn't.
Are you sitting on like a cachet of the wall
I'm just
stickers?
joking.
I have like a couple left.
I'm having an existential crisis. I have a couple cool stickers. I think I still have one go on.
Yeah.
I got one from the podcast. So this is
Earn and burn. Use it or lose it. Next, save it for your next new laptop.
I feel like I'm gonna have something like in my water bottle. I've got a stainless steel water bottle. It's like this is a sales pitch. I don't want to like put all my cool all my one-offs on.
Was it laptops or just your
So
Really, it's a side.
get a
I'm a proud owner of
problem
a
rare
Rake
or a skin or something and
Wallet
put
shirt
stickers
from
on
like
like that.
one of their original marketing campaigns.
Then that you can port as long as you get the
Something
same
that's like
size.
I've only worn it a few times and it's got like a,
Yeah, like a.
it's got like a zombie looking kangaroo and it says go wall.
I got these
It looks totally different than
Oh, I
anything.
know.
nice.
Yeah, it's really cool.
I forget what we call it. It's like
Yeah, I totally know which one you're talking about.
essentially a whiteboard sticker that's sized for various Apple apps. Pretty cool. I'm about getting.
And if I got it,
So I'll probably stick with the 13.
I think I got it using the app and I was
It's
inserting
like-
it right on.
Yeah.
You're like a hot spot. And then, you know, like, go here's a hot place and then they were there.
Yeah.
And they go, oh, hang out those shirts. Like,
Just
right
run the
there.
messages Walker sitting in front of the water.
It was super, yeah. It was very random. Totally different.
Someone I know put up a picture of her laptop with stickers, and I immediately I'm like, wow, I need this. Like, where did you get this? And she got the Postgres. That's where I
It's got, I mean, everybody there is.
Everybody took it. Am I right?
Basically, turn it back to the
Yeah, as long as you
just hold it on that page. You can see what I wrote, like,
no, it's good. I mean, they're
yeah,
all.
you can just write with a whiteboard marker on it.
It's got like a, it took a while for me to get used to like the culture, I
That
guess.
might be another way to like do that and then
I
put
don't know.
it.
I've never been in that kind of seriously exactly the way that they present themselves. Like it is not like there's no behind the scenes like secrets. Everything's very cool. Everything's very easy. Paint. I don't know. Somehow they make it work.
Mixed results for that. In terms of quality of recording.
I really don't think all the big very little bullshit. Everybody
Well,
like that.
There's no like focus.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
That works great. That works fine. Parliamentary. Except that like what you get is just like this
Yeah.
photo of.
I
Thought spots.
I know that stuff.
I'd love to
Stuff
leave
that comes off a
and get
whiteboard.
like our own office.
I
know. I'm used to it. You know, having to adjust to like
all around it. It's like it's
situation sucks. I'm on a wait list right now.
You might get like $5 worth of that.
So I've got a pretty standard spot. I park far west and then I just ride my skateboard.
around the outside of the whiteboard.
Isn't it amazing how
I look cool and shit. One day I want to wear it.
there's never been a single one that works properly.
Like
I always think like,
Yeah.
oh, just
All the way.
wipe napkin
100%
and wipe
just
it
like,
off, and then you can't sign it properly.
skateboard on the website. Like, what's wrong with that?
I need to learn how to stop better. Because I am scared of shit.
You gotta, you stop the same way you pump.
Your whiteboard becomes red.
Yeah.
I'm serious. Like, it took me a while to figure that out. So you go down a hill and like, there's people at the bottom of the hill. You gotta figure that shit out.
Yeah, like I mean, I can do it. I am like so afraid that my foot just gonna like stick and
Nah, you just, it's easy.
I mean, you get used to it, right?
Tap, tap, tap.
Do we have a mic up here? Can you all hear me? I feel like there's a microphone.
Yeah, we got one.
There's a built-in microphone up here.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, fancy.
Yeah, I know. It is pretty fancy.
I can hear
I
something.
can pretend like I'm holding a microphone. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on. It works.
I can also pretend like I'm holding a
Now
microphone.
you turned it on.
On?
No, I
On?
think it's just not close
Off.
enough to your mouth.
On?
Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, thank you all very much for coming out, braving the rain of which there is none anymore. You already found the pizza. You've already found the drinks. I would like to thank our sponsor, Keep Ruby Weird. Would anyone from Keep Ruby Weird like to say a few words about their sponsorship? Okay. if you're interested in sponsoring Awesome on Rails or know someone who's interested, like let us know, because we're always looking for sponsors. We did not get a drink sponsor tonight, and there's some other big news. If you have been joining us for drinks, BD Riley's has been awful, just absolutely awful. You can't hear a word anybody says. So tonight we're making a kind of like last minute decision, and instead we're gonna try a new bar. There is no drink sponsor, so it will be like BYO Wallet. But we will be convening. You don't have to buy a drink. You can just like order a water or whatever. We're going to CU 29. It's like right across the street. CU like Copper is. If you look it up on Google, is it CU or is it Copper?
CU.
Okay, CU 29. So if you go to BD Riley's and there's like nobody there, it's because we're not going there.
Yay for not having to yell over a band for the entire time.
Yeah. Okay. So housekeeping, we have bathrooms. If you go like back that way and take a right, then there's gentlemen's and ladies on opposite sides. We already have pizza. I guess I mentioned that. Anything else? We're gonna have 2 speakers. We'll have 1 speaker, then we'll have a little bit of a break. And since Damon's not here, I guess we're also not doing a raffle. We could raffle off a pizza.
Or you could just eat it, I guess.
Yeah, or you could just eat it.
I'm frustrated that we don't use Raffler. You know how much of a pain in the ass it was to get that thing on upgraded on Heroku?
I have no idea.
It was a nightmare.
So for those of you who do not know, Britt is one of the co-organizers of Keep Ruby Weird. As a co-organizer of Keep Ruby Weird, would you like to use your time slot to tell people how frustrated you are with maintaining Raffler?
No, but we're almost done with the website for Keep Ruby Weird 3. So everybody get your checkbooks ready. We're going to put tickets on sale soon.
Yeah, just start refreshing right now.
Yeah. I promise within the next 7 to 10 days, at some point, it will be a new website and you will be able to purchase a ticket. That's all.
Okay, yeah, that's all. Thank you all again very much. And first off, we have Chad. He's going to be talking about something very near and dear to my heart, which is facepalming.
Yes.
And then after that, going to Foolproof. Chad works at Heroku along with me, does amazing database stuff. Like, totally catch him at some point in time if you can, and be like, what's the worst thing you've ever seen a customer do?
It's funny you ask.
He's got some war stories.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, Chad.
Thank y'all. This thing is a little bit wobbly. Is this coming through okay? Sounds like it?
Yep.
Cool, all right. So, as Richard said, my name is Chad, Chad Bailey. I work at Heroku. I'm on the support team there. I've been on the support team there for a little bit over 2 years now. I've done a variety of support things. You may have interacted with me at some point. If so, you might not recognize me by this face. You might recognize this picture, which is about 2 years and 20 pounds ago. If you filed support tickets, I've been on the other side of those for a long time. I've answered things about everything from standard Rails apps all the way through databases, and now some of our fancy Salesforce stuff. But I see a lot of Rails apps. I see a lot of people doing smart things, people doing stupid things, and a lot of things that I think with a little bit of advice, I can help people avoid some very common pitfalls. So that's kind of what I'm here to talk about tonight. First, I wanted to show you this. This happened like yesterday. This is the kind of stuff we deal with. I'm going to give everybody a second just to read this. I did not make this up. This actually happened, as you can see, on the 23rd of June. Fortunately, the questions we're talking about tonight are a little bit more advanced than that. Anybody have any questions? I'm kidding.
Do you support English?
Yes, we do support English. We support lots of different languages, including English. Actually, I put this in here because I need to ask y'all some questions. How many people have went to RailsConf this year? A few, a smattering, a couple. Excellent. And so I'm guessing, did either of you see John McCarty do a version of this talk there? You might recognize the purple slides. Richard did. How many of you run a Rails app in production? Hopefully a lot of you, most of you. Excellent, cool, awesome. Just out of curiosity, it's not relevant for the talk, but how many do that on Heroku? Anybody? A handful, excellent, cool. And then how many of you have face-palmed hard after a production incident where you did something stupid? Hopefully most of those same hands go up. All right, cool. I know I certainly have. And there are a lot of things we can do when we take an app that runs fine on our machine, move it to something like Heroku, or just to a production environment where things change a little bit and create a lot of kind of facepalm-worthy situations. So in order to kind of illustrate these things, I want to walk you through a fictional and very unfortunate customer called Airless B&B. We've solved all the problems of renting out, you know, the sharing economy of shared spaces. Well, what if now you want to actually go to space and rent a place in space? That's Airless B&B. It's got a cool logo. It's a rocket emoji. And this is the company we'll be talking about. So, first things first. I have 10 different things I'm going to talk about in terms of reasons you might facepalm. Let's start with this. Let's say you're the customer, you come to me and you say, you know what, I ran a benchmark and my site is running awfully slow online right now. And so I asked you to go run an Apache bench. Is everybody familiar with this tool? Maybe, maybe not. AB is a great tool. This is just I'm going to kind of just sprinkle pro tips throughout this. AB is a great tool for running simple load tests on your app. So what we're doing here is we're saying, I want you to run 100 concurrent requests, total of 500 requests to my website, which is airlessbnb.com. And looking at the response time here, okay, this is respectable, I guess. We're averaging about 41 requests per second, an average time per request of about 2.5 seconds. That's kind of slow. Let's see if we can figure out why that might be the case. This happens far more than you might realize, and you've probably done it too. The first thing I will do is I'll go ask the customer, okay, what happens when you run Rails server -e production? Is that line a harbinger of doom for anyone else? This, believe it or not, we see this far too often on Heroku, and people don't realize that out of the box, at least in many historical versions of Rails, out of the box, if you run Rails server, what you get is WebRake. WebRake is a web server that is great for development, great for local debugging and testing, all that kind of stuff. Not super great for running in production. And as it turns out, a lot of time we get a surprising number of people running very large sites that might be spending a lot of money on Heroku. And part of the reason why they've scaled up and they're spending a lot of money is because of WebRake. All they've done is just, you know, they don't know that a web server is a thing they should go look at. And so they do that. What do I recommend instead? TLDR, Puma. We like Puma at Heroku. We've kind of recently changed a lot of our documentation over. We used to be real big on Unicorn. Don't get me wrong, I love Unicorn as well. Both of these, Unicorn and Puma, are vast improvements over WebRake in terms of performance, but we like Puma a lot. Puma is great because without doing a lot of changing and tweaking, you get some basic multi-threading as well as process concurrency. Basically, your web server now can do a whole lot more than it used to be able to. The problem with WebRake is that it is single-threaded, single process. So if Richard makes a request to my site and says, hey, I need this website that's going to take 2.5 seconds to load, I'm going to start generating that response. Meanwhile, Britt makes another request, asks for that same page. I won't even start processing Britt's request until Richard's is done. I will send it. I will churn on it for 2.5 seconds, send Richard his response. Then I'll start Britt's page. That takes me another 2.5 seconds. Britt waits a total of 5 seconds to get his page back. That's bad. We don't like that. What's great about Puma is that it will allow me to process a lot of these requests in parallel and therefore vastly increase my throughput in terms of what I can do on each of my processes. That applies for VPSs or servers. That applies for Heroku dynos, really just kind of across the map. It's super easy to do. All you do is you go to your gem file, you say gem Puma, you can throw that in there, and even just out of the box, you'll see a marked performance improvement without doing any tweaking whatsoever, just by literally turning on Puma. This was our benchmark before. We were doing about 41 requests a second. Boom, 82. We literally doubled our throughput simply by switching WebRake to Puma default configuration, no tweaking whatsoever. Now, if you want to go a little bit more advanced with this, you can go in and control how many threads Puma will use to try to concurrently serve requests. You can control how many worker processes it will create. You can create a massive amount of concurrency on a single server or a single dyno just by using Puma and setting these couple of config settings here. So great, we're done. We fixed it, right? We made our website literally twice as fast, twice as concurrently fast by simply just adding a line in the gem file, tweaking our config. That's all it took, right? No, actually, what we've done now is it inadvertently created problem number 2 I want to talk about, which is this. This is a graph of, and I'm pulling this from some Heroku metrics here. This is a graph of my memory usage on my dyno as I'm running now. Hey, this great new Puma thing, I'm running all this concurrency. This is what my memory graph looks like. That's not super great. And the reason that's not super great is because of this blue section up here. Who is familiar with swap memory and why that's bad? A handful of people. Cool. I will try to keep this kind of brief because I could totally talk for an hour about this. But the way modern operating systems work and the way Linux works, for example, which is what most of us are running in production, is that Linux will pretend it has way more memory available than it actually does. You might only have a gigabyte of memory, for example, actual physical memory in your server, and Linux will say, hey, you know what, I got tons and tons and tons of memory. Just use as much as you want. What I'll do is once I fill up my physical memory, I will just silently, without really telling you, start putting some of the things in memory actually onto your storage, your hard disk, your spinning disk, your SSD, whatever. The important thing is that's way slower. As soon as we get into this territory where I'm trying to use more memory than I have physically available, that dramatically slows things down and really affects the performance of your app. So this up here, this blue, indicates RAM that I'm using that is now being swapped out to disk, which is making my app run way slower than it should. There are a couple of common sources of this. One of them is just straight up memory leaks. A very smart fellow by the name of Richard Schneeman wrote this tool called Derailed Benchmarks that is one thing you can use to try to go track down if there actually are memory leaks in your application that can be really gnarly to troubleshoot. That's a great place to start, as well as reading that blog post there. And then also, as I mentioned before with Puma, if you just configure too much concurrency with Puma, it's entirely possible that you create that situation where you're just using too much RAM on your server. Any questions on this aspect of it? Like I said, I could go long on it if you'd like. If there's specific questions, I'm happy to answer them now. This is one way you can look at your memory usage just directly running on your server if you're into that sort of thing. Free-m will show you your total and your used and free memory. What you want to look for is your total usage. You want swap to be relatively low. That's a good thing. And then I mentioned before, I already showed you this slide, but this is where if you're running a traditional Rails app and you're doing it on Heroku or somewhere and you're running into swap problems, if you've recently deployed Puma, this is probably where to go look. In particular, threads don't necessarily dramatically increase your RAM usage. What will really kill you is if you've forked a whole bunch of parallel workers. Those are essentially, and granted, copy on write makes this a little bit trickier, but in general, if you're running a lot of workers, that can really blow up your memory usage, so that's something to definitely keep an eye on. If you're on Heroku, you can actually go to your dashboard. We have these cool graphs now that show you averaged metrics. You might also use New Relic. New Relic's a great tool as a way to just kind of get a sense for your memory usage. You can also install the Librato add-on is a good way to visualize the memory usage. So if you're seeing all of a sudden a ton of slow requests, that might be a place to look. If you're swapping RAM to disk, that's bad. Okay, so we've solved the first problem, we've solved the second problem. Now, we're actually getting some traction in our app, right? People are coming, they're renting these Airbnbs in space. They're giving us tremendous amounts of money because you know that it's not cheap to go to space. We're starting to rake in money hand over fist. But then the hackers show up. This is bad, right? All of a sudden, we don't know why, but we are literally burning money. We have money going out the door. And here's why. Quick, what's wrong with that URL? Ugh. No S. That's super easy to do. We've all done it. You can throw a single line in your config production.rb to force SSL, to force everything to be secure. If you're running on bare metal or a VPS or you have Nginx, you can also have Nginx do the dirty work for you and just 301 everything to the secure version of that. Super easy config tweak to make. Can be super expensive if you don't know to make it before you go to production. So be aware of that. Lawyers. We had this cool, yes.
But how do I get SSL on my server to support SSL if I'm running on Heroku?
Thank you for that softball question, Richard Schneeman. For a long time, I know that one of the things that people gripe to me most about when I tell people, oh, I work at Heroku, they go, oh, that's great, I love Heroku, except grr, $20 a month for SSL add-on. I know that sucks. We know that sucks. Everybody thinks that sucks. So we're trying to make it go away. We just released a beta of, what's the marketing buzzword term for it? Do you remember? I know it's SNI SSL under the hood. Do you remember what we called it?
Cheaper SSL.
Free SSL beta. Long story short, because of some relatively recent additions to SSL and how it's served, we now offer free. Basically, we offer SSL for free. You still have to buy a certificate. You bring your certificate, but you can now use a certificate to secure your site on your own domain without having to pay Heroku that stupid $20 a month. So just Google that. Google Heroku free SSL. Or just go to blog.heroku.com and you'll see it's one of the recent blog posts where we talk about exactly how we did free SSL for everybody. So get on that. And if you're trying to get in and you can't, because I think we were gating people at the time, talk to Richard or me and we can totally sneak you around in the side door and get you in. But now I want to talk about lawyers. Things are going well for Airless BNB. We had this cool rocket emoji logo until some jerky company came to us and said they already had a trademark on the cool rocket logo and they told us we had to change it. So we talked to the lawyers. The lawyers said, well, the only trademark we couldn't find is for the comet emoji, which I think is that one. And so why don't we just change all of our branding everything to the comet emoji? Cool, so we give that to the designers. The designers go off, change a bunch of things in the templates. Now this is happening. All of our images are those stupid little boxes. Ugh, why did this happen? I'll give you a hint, it's my favorite feature in Rails. Asset pipeline. Who has been bitten by this in production? I know I certainly have, more than a few times. The asset pipeline, among other things, does this to all of your assets. All of your images, all of your scripts, all of your style sheets, all of your everything. Puts these cool cache-busting fingerprints on it. I will admit, as much as I sometimes despise the asset pipeline because of tickets, it is great for doing this because it was a complete disaster before this, and now it's a slightly different kind of disaster that in most ways is a lot better. But the thing that is far too easy to forget is that this is not how you do it. You don't just reference the path to an asset. What you need to do is use these cool little helpers that Rails gives you all over the place. In this case, there's a method called image tag. What that does is say, please give me the cool, fingerprinted cached version of the asset that normally I would just call logo.ping. This can be tricky because in some circumstances this might actually work this top version will work fine in development depending on a variety of very messy things. But you might notice that when you ship to production, all of a sudden, boom, none of my assets show up. If that's the case, go dig around and look for these things. And they can hide in sometimes some unexpected places. This is a good example. In your style sheets, you might have written a logo class and you just said, oh, background image URL, there's the URL for the background image. You actually need to use, again, there's a helper, image-URL, that will fetch the fingerprinted, assetized version of the file you're actually trying to load. The other thing that bites us quite a bit with the asset pipeline is pre-compilation. I know I do this all the time where, I need to load a separate JavaScript for the admin area or whatever, and then I build it in, everything works fine in development, and then I push to production, and all of a sudden, random bits of my JavaScript aren't loading, and I don't exactly know why. In production, if you're running in an environment where you're pre-compiling your assets, which, God, I hope you're pre-compiling your assets, either you're running on Heroku or you're doing that as part of a build step, you need to go in and tell Rails exactly what assets you want to pre-compile. You can create an initializer, because Rails will do a lot of this by default for you. It will, like your application.scss, your application.js. Rails just kind of handles those. But you can create an initializer and say, oh, by the way, Rails, I also want you to pre-compile these assets too. Yes?
Not sure if somebody can correct me, but maybe 4.2 and maybe 4.1, I don't know, that also gives you an error in development. So.
That's a good point. I know that. Do you know the specifics of that when that was added? And
it's based on your version of Rails, Sprockets Rails. Okay. So you should be running the most recent, and then you'll get a helpful error. Yeah. If you're not running Rails 4.1, then there's a gem called Sprockets Better Errors by this guy whose name totally escapes me right now. But you could add that to your gem file and get that. Yeah.
Yeah. So relatively recent versions of Rails make this slightly less painful. I kid, one, because Richard's sitting right there, two, because assets in general are just kind of a tire fire, and I think that the asset pipeline goes a long way to helping that, but not necessarily perfect. No software is. So we move on to number 5. Everything was going great. All of a sudden, I was clicking around on the site. I'm starting getting these 500 errors. I get these weird looking error pages, and I don't know why. I need to know what's happening inside my app. I have bugs. Believe it or not, Airless B&B does occasionally have bugs in it. A lot of times, the first question we will ask is, hey, is this happening a lot? Is this a common error? Are you seeing this a lot? And the answer we get back is, maybe. I'm not really sure because I don't have visibility into what my app is necessarily doing in production. Far too common, and the reason is that people don't necessarily know what's happening with their production logs. I will say that Heroku makes this far too easy because of the way everything just kind of works. It's far too easy to push an app out to Heroku, see that it works, and not realize that you aren't logging the way you should be until it's too late. It's an entirely separate set of problems if you're running on your own VPS. You need to worry about log rotated, various things like that. But Heroku very much buys into this philosophy that logging is a stream of events. I don't know, how many of you have seen the 12-factor website? If you haven't, I'd strongly recommend checking it out. It's a guy named Adam Wiggins, who is so smart, he started a thing called Heroku. Also wrote this kind of manifesto about how he thinks apps that run on the web should be built and should behave and stuff like that. One of his kind of, tenets of belief, if you will, is that an app should not really be concerned with logging. What it should do is just take events that happen, shove them somewhere, and let something else deal with it. Heroku's version of that is if you redirect all of your logs to standard out, then we will take those logs, shove them into this thing called Logplex, and ship them out to lots of interesting places. The important thing is if you're running on Heroku specifically, you might need to go add this line into your config/environment.rb file to just ensure that instead of writing to a production.log, you're writing things to standard out. I know that there are various gems and or config things that we've tried to automatically push on people to make this happen in the past. But this, at the end of the day, this is what you need to do, is just make sure that you're logging to standard out. We still get far too many tickets from people that didn't realize that and have shipped apps to production that are still logging to production.log on the dyno, and that of course just disappears because ephemeral file system. Okay, so we solved the log problem, we solved the web server problem, we've fixed a couple of gotchas with things like SSL and stuff like that, and now we're really trucking. We're really moving, right? We are shipping features every day, we are rolling things out, things are going well, and then customers start to complain because all of a sudden the site is unavailable at times. Why is the site unavailable at times? Because this is an actual deploy script that a friend of mine, John McCarty, saw in use on a production application. Shell script to stop production, hope that works because then we're going to sleep for 4 seconds. And then we're going to start production. Now, every request that came to the site in between those two, and honestly quite a bit that came while that was running, Nginx just said, backend went away. 500 errors all over the place. This is bad because it leaves your application unavailable for long periods of time. Now, I would imagine most people here probably have some sort of mature build and deploy process in place for production apps, but is anybody still running something that they are willing to admit uses a kind of spit and duct tape approach like this? Anybody? Have we moved on to this? Good, I don't see any hands. That makes me feel...
If you migrate.
What's that?
If you migrate.
There you go, yeah. It's a good example. One thing I can recommend here, I have a friend of mine that really likes this Mina tool for doing distributed deploys. It's a little bit different from Capistrano in the sense that it does some smarts to create bash scripts and kind of minimize the amount of connections you have to open and close to servers and stuff. So something to look at. And then of course, this is where I get to do my Heroku commercial. If you haven't shipped things on Heroku, you'll notice that looks very similar actually. If you haven't shipped things on Heroku, it's super easy to use Heroku's super awesome build and deployment pipeline. All you do is just create an app, and then you just git push Heroku master. That takes your app, runs through the asset pre-compilation, lots of other build steps, and deploys it. It's a very mature, well thought out deployment process. Richard Schneeman here is responsible for at least some of the pieces of what happens when you get push Heroku master, at least with a Ruby app. One thing I should mention in the interest of keeping your app available and online, and people at Heroku, including me, have very mixed emotions about this feature, but if you run Heroku features enable preboot on your app, that will turn on pre-boot. Who is familiar with pre-boot, what it does, how it behaves? Anyone? A few? Good, not many hands, because I do want to talk about it. This is a super cool tool if you run stuff on production, or run stuff in production on Heroku. What this does is, normally when you run a Heroku app, you do a git push Heroku master that creates a build, and the build might take 10 or 15 minutes, whatever, that's fine. Your app's still running on your old dynos while that happens. But once the slug compilation is complete and we start up your new app, we send a signal to essentially stop your old dynos at the same time that we send the signal to start your new dynos. Now, for most reasonably small apps, that's fine, because if it only takes you a few seconds for your app to start up, if you have a relatively newish Rails app and it might take you 5 or 10 seconds for the app to launch, it's honestly not that much better than Sleep 4, but at the end of the day, that's how Heroku normally works out of the box. We stop your dynos and we start your new dynos at the same time, but those dynos might not be ready to accept requests for 5 seconds. Maybe sometimes up to a minute. I mean, a lot of older Rails apps, especially, if you have a big gem party in your app, then it might take you a minute or more for your app to preload all the code and actually start accepting requests. What pre-boot does is, instead of immediately turning off your old dynos, it essentially starts a 3-minute timer, leaves your old dynos running, and starts up your new dynos. And during those 3 minutes, the old dynos are still accepting requests. Your new dynos are coming online, getting booted, and essentially indicating to the router they are ready to accept requests. Then when 3 minutes is up, we kill the old dynos and start sending requests to the new dynos. So it's pretty nice. It's kind of like a cheap version of a zero downtime deploy, if you will. We start up the new dynos, let them get up to speed, let them run, and then finally turn off the old one, start the new one. You do have to be aware of some caveats with that. For example, if you have a whole bunch of database connections, you will temporarily double your number of database connections. There are other weird behaviors and edge cases around if you deploy and then restart a bunch of dynos and try to make a lot of changes all in very, very quick succession. You might end up with behavior you weren't expecting. But for the most part, for the general use case of I deploy even several times a day, pre-boot is awesome for making sure that your app is always able to respond to requests. Any questions about pre-boot? Anybody had problems with it? Thoughts? I highly encourage you to at least play with it. Yes?
When would I not want to enable this?
So it's an interesting question, because in most, I can't really think of a good categorical example of why you might not want to turn this on. The main thing is if you do a lot of manual management of dynos, so if you're the kind of person that hire fire, for example, or otherwise you're doing a lot of start this, stop that kind of thing, you can get some weird behavior with dynos starting and then stopping, and the old dynos never actually stopping and stuff like that. The other big case, honestly, though, is database connections. If you're on, say you're on a standard 4 Postgres database on Heroku, which has a limit of 500 connections, and say you run a crap ton of database connections normally. Maybe your app is running 300 connections to the database, for example. You have so many dynos, so much parallelism that it's not uncommon that you have 300 connections open. Well, the way pre-boot works is we start your new dynos, we don't stop your old ones yet, so you still have these 300 connections from the old ones, from your old dynos, and your new dynos now try to fire up another 300 database connections. And that you're gonna have a bad time because you're gonna basically run into a limit. So as long as you don't have a tremendous number of database connections, that's kind of the main thing. Richard, can you think of any other weird edge cases that you've experienced where pre-boot isn't a good idea?
So it's purely hypothetical, but it's if you are writing, you have to always consider that a request from your old site can hit your new site. So if you did something you changed the way you're authenticating checkouts or something like that, maybe you changed the way that you are verifying that your checkout session is still good or something, then if someone makes a request from the old site, it might hit the new site and then fail. Or even worse, it might succeed in some really bizarre kind of way. I mean, it's I think probably the hardest part about it is once you run with it, you kind of forget that it's running. But it's also if you have code reviews or whatever, then hopefully somebody should be hey, keep in mind that,
Yeah.
So it's not replacement for something that does load balancing where Only new requests will go to the new dynos versus old requests will continue going to the old ones.
Right. It's not like session affinity or any of that kind of thing. It's at a moment in time, your old dynos will cease to exist and your new dynos will be accepting requests. The other big one I just remembered is database migrations. If your code is written in a way such that your app can only exist with one version of the database, you have to be aware of that, because if you deploy, it's like, say you deploy code that's supposed to be running with a new like schema, for example. For 3 minutes, you're still going to have dynos running that are like using the old schema, but if you like try to run a migration, maybe it's going to break things in there. Like, you've got to be wary of the fact that you're going to have 2 different versions of your code base running concurrently, and if they expect very different things from your database, you might not, that might not work. There's certainly times when, and so like a lot of times what people will do in that case is they will just temporarily disable preboot. All you got to do is features disable preboot. Disable preboot, run your new deploy, run Rake DB migrate, everything comes back up, then you just turn preboot back on. Sometimes, and that also depends on the migration. There are a lot of times this is a minor change and we think it's fine, then you can get by with running simultaneous different versions of code. Question in the back?
Back to a large number of database connections. Do you know what the allowed number is by default in Postgres?
On Heroku and in many, many deploys of Postgres, that's 500. There's some lower plans on Heroku that that give you a smaller number of connections. I think the standard 0 is still 120, if I'm not mistaken. Pretty quickly climbs up to 500 though. There are some places like RDS where you can configure Postgres with a larger number of connections, but that's generally not advisable. Postgres starts to behave a little strangely sometimes with very, very large numbers of connections. The other thing to keep in mind there, if you are running that many database connections, you can almost certainly throw, there's a tool called PG Bouncer that you can run at various places in the infrastructure that essentially serves as a database connection multiplexer. So a lot of times what we see is, especially if customers are running on like Performance M or like big dynos and they're running a lot of concurrency, Rails by default will give you 5 database connections per process. So if I go back to that Puma slide where we configured Puma, you might be running 32 workers on a a Performance M dyno on Heroku. And if that's the case, then each of those dynos out of the box could use up to 132 times 5, 150, 160, could be using up to 160 database connections, which is almost certainly not necessary. What you can do is actually run this process called PG Bouncer on the dyno that lets the app open 160 connections to essentially a local socket, and that socket then combines all of those connections into just like maybe 10 persistent connections back to the server. So if you need to run a lot of database connections in production, very often you can stick PG Bouncer in the middle, and that will let you drastically reduce the number of connections that actually make it all the way to your database. Does that make sense? Ish. That would be a lot easier to explain if I'd put a slide in here about that, but happy to draw pictures on napkins afterwards if I need to.
At CU29.
Yes, at CU29, exactly.
Does preboot, is it isolated to your web dynos, or do I also does it double my worker dynos, and do I have to count that when I'm calculating my database connection?
I believe it's only web, because workers, I think it just kind of goes immediately. I need to double check that, but I'm 95% certain on that.
Checking.
Schneeman's on it. I'm going to charge ahead, and you can tell me if I was wrong. Because we're getting close. This is number 7.
It only applies to web.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. So now, one morning I wake up, it's terrible. Everything's terrible. Everything has literally gone to crap, because when I go to the site now, every place I had a nice starry picture of a cool new little airless B&B has been replaced by a literal picture of crap, by the smiling happy turd emoji, which I love. Why has that happened? Ugh. This literally happened to a member of the Heroku support team a week before he started on the support team. Not anyone in this room, thankfully, but it is far too easy to commit secrets to your repo if you're not careful. Most people use something like, an s3.yaml file to configure your S3 gem or something like that. And you think, oh, I'll just go in there, I'll put my access key ID, I'll put everything just right there in that config file, git commit, git push, what's the big deal? Well, like if you have an open repo, if your GitHub repo is not private, there are literally thousands of robots out there right now that are just crawling through GitHub looking for people that do this sort of thing, and then they go grab those credentials and either screw around with your site or spin up a bunch of resources that you now are on the hook for. That guy I was talking about got I think it was a $14,000 bill from Amazon for one night. He like literally committed some credentials, pushed them to a repo, went to bed, woke up the morning, went, oh my goodness, I just committed credentials. I better go wipe that out of the repo. Wiped it. But even in just that evening, somebody had accumulated $14,000 of charges on his account. So this is really, really, really easy to screw up if you're not careful. There are a couple of ways you should be managing secrets in your app if you're not doing this already. One that's built into Rails is config secrets.yaml. This was added relatively recently as a kind of a first-class citizen. Richard, do you remember when?
Rails 4.1.
Okay, yeah. But now you can have a secrets file where you put all these secrets. And please, 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 please go gitignore it. Add that file to your .gitignore file so that it never gets committed to your repo. And then so you can store all of your secrets in this one file, and you know that it's ignored, and you know that it's never in your repo, and so you know that it's safe in that way. And then this is how you call it from your app. You just rails.application.secrets. Whatever the key was in the YAML file. Of course, if you're on Heroku, you can use my preferred way, which is just to use environment variables. You can use this gem if you're not running Foreman or something. You can use this gem to essentially allow you to use a .env file locally. Then you store all of your secrets in a .env file. Of course, gitignore it again. But set up your entire app environment in that .env file, and then just Heroku config add your secret key and your value, and that gets pushed to Heroku. And this is handy too. I don't know if you saw it in my config Puma file, but anything that you want to be able to change about your app without having to recompile and redeploy it, you can stick in a config var like this, which is really nice on Heroku. In your app, you just call them as env. And here's an example of, so for example, if you use like add-ons on Heroku, we will set certain config var values for you in your environment. So like you might Heroku add-ons create Redis, and then you can call that Redis just by using the environment variable that is set. Any questions on that? Highly recommended. Getting close to the end. Thank y'all for sticking with me here. We're almost there. And then one day, a developer walks in and hands you this graph. And you think, oh, this is good, right? This has got to be number of monthly active users, or it's got to be money, or no, no. That's a graph of database response time. What have you done? This is New Relic, of course. And you can see here that like, okay, we got Ruby down nice and low. Our Ruby is averaging like less than 25 milliseconds. Ruby is awesome, except now database is this huge, disgusting orange blob in our New Relic. And now everything in our database is slow. So let's see if we can figure out why that might be happening. So here's how I'm loading a user for one of the pages on the site. Hey, that's pretty cool, right? That's pretty standard query. Select users from users where user's username is Jay McCarty. Well, in a small app with 5,000-ish records, that runs in like 2.3 milliseconds. That's great. It's reasonably fast, right? All of a sudden now you have a large app, 231,000 records. That same query, just loading a user, takes 51.7 milliseconds. Does anybody have any idea why that might be the case? No indexes. Ding, 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 ding. I've done this far more than I care to admit. I know. Hopefully, we all have. I've done it a lot, and I'm a database person. You think you have an index on a column, or like me, when you started, you learned Rails in a really weird, convoluted way, and you didn't even know that database indexes were a thing you were supposed to do. Don't laugh. I've totally done it. I know lots of people that learned Rails in various ways that didn't know the particulars of how you should be operating with your database. It's very straightforward to add an index. So in this case, if we're looking at by the username, we can add an index on the username. That makes it way faster for Postgres to look up things that we ask for. So this is how, using a database migration, you can add an index on the username column to the users table. And this essentially makes it much, much faster for Postgres to look up users by their username. This is what the numbers look like before the index. That same query that was 51.7 milliseconds. Now we can load that user in 1 millisecond. It's a lot better, right? You can even get fancy with your index. This is, again, is a whole nother topic. I think I might have even done a presentation at Austin on Rails a couple years ago about kind of like exploring this avenue of performance improvement. But You might have some slightly more complicated queries where you have a couple of where clauses and things. You can get pretty tricky with how you define indexes that makes it way faster for certain queries to run. So if you find yourself running up on queries that are getting slow, you might be able to just add an index and make that problem just disappear. Any questions on that? I'm happy to elaborate if anyone wants to talk particulars about it. Most of y'all probably already know this. Yes?
I've run into needing, what is it, algorithm concurrently if I'm going to deploy to production, and I don't want my indexes to lock up my database and
Yes.
cause my customers to be
That is a
unhappy.
super important point that some people might not know about. If you look at the, and there's a way to make Active Record do it, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but if I go back to this slide for a second, this add index user's username will generate a query that says, create index, index name, on, column, table, whatever. When you run that in Postgres, Postgres will then acquire an exclusive lock on the table to read through the entire table and write that entire index, which means that the rest of your app will grind to a halt while Postgres generates the index on that column. That's bad because that means that no requests are getting through, nothing is happening. Postgres is essentially blocking everything until it can write that index. There's a way with Active Record, and I know it's an option that hangs off the end somewhere, but essentially the query that you want is create index concurrently. And what that does is it takes a much longer amount of time. It might take 4 times as long overall to generate and populate that index, but it does not lock your app while that's happening. Like I said, it runs longer, but it lets your app function. That's super, super important. If you don't know it off the top of your head, then Google it because it's super handy and useful. You want to create these indices concurrently. Thank you for calling that out. There are similar workflows if you need to do things like create columns and populate default values, stuff like that. There are a lot of ways that if you're not careful, as you're making changes to the database, you might inadvertently lock it. I think that's a topic for another time. Oh yeah, let me get back to that. All right, we're getting close. We're getting real close here. Feel that $1 billion valuation. It's coming. Now everything's going great. People are booking these airless B&Bs by the thousands. You go on these profile pages and there's picture after picture of happy user that are leaving great reviews for all of our airless B&Bs. I think these hands are terrifying. Some of Apple's emojis, especially that one, just really creeps me out. But then we notice all of a sudden that all these user avatar pictures are loading really, really slowly and making page loads go real slow. Why might that be the case? Here's another thing that we see all too often. Okay, my controller, I'm going to grab all of the photos for all these users. These are all like the user avatars. Then in my view down here, for each photo, I'm going to look through. I'm going to grab the photo.url so I can display it. Now I'm going to go grab the user's name so I can display their name under their avatar, right? Photo.user.username. Does anybody see the problem with that line of code?
N+1.
Yay, it's an N+1 query. Ugh. What is N+1? Some of you might be asking that didn't answer the question, which is a totally valid question. That is one of those computer sciencey terms where the number of queries that result is dependent on the size of the data set. So if I'm trying to load 10 pictures, I'm going to actually end up making 11 queries to the database. One to get the list of things, and then one query for each of the things I need to get. So if I need 10 things, I got 11 queries. If I need 13 things, that's 14 queries. If I need n things, I'm going to end up running n+1 queries on my database to get that, which is slow. Rails makes it super easy to fix that. There's this cool method you can call called .includes that tells Rails, hey, I want you to go eagerly load this association. So when you're getting all these photos, while you're at it, can you please just like give me one query that gives me all the users for all those photos? It's super handy. It takes all this nonsense right here and turns it into this. A single query to get all the photos, and then a single query to get all of the users that are associated with those photos. And I've seen this get real super bad and take apps offline far more than I would think would be reasonable. If you think you might have some of these hiding in your app and you're not sure where, there's this really cool gem called Bullet that you add to your gem file, and then you go look at your database running either in production or locally, and you'll see things in your log that says, oh hey, I noticed there's an N+1 query, you might want to fix this. And what's cool is it even like spits out Oh, you just include, it tells you even exactly what to add to your methods hiding in your app somewhere. Any questions about N+1s? Everybody that may or may not have seen those before. Last one. I think this is the first presentation in my life I'm ever going to actually end on time, believe it or not. Because we are at our final problem. Our final problem is sleepy time. All of a sudden we've noticed that certain requests to our app are going super, super slow. We've solved all these other things. We feel like we've knocked out all the N+1s, but there's something that's still causing super slow requests in our application. What, pray tell, is the culprit? Well, so now we go back to New Relic, and we look in here and we see, okay, all this other stuff running reasonably fine. Okay, 187, that's not great. Whatever. Holy cow, look at Photos Controller Create. That action is taking 5 seconds, which is an eternity for a web request. That's probably bad. So we look at New Relic's cool like breakdown table of what's taking all of the time. And some of you out there are probably already seeing the thing in there that's bad and terrible. Anybody want to take a guess as to what it is? Nobody's shouting out. That's awesome. This is one where it's actually like legitimately hiding in there. Boom, net HTTP. We're going to get from S3, and then we're going to put something else back to S3. This, believe it or not, is bad, and actually is kind of one of the, I would call it like the final gateway of you've knocked out all the easy performance problems. This one can hide in subtle ways that you're probably not expecting. Here's why this is a problem. In this case, say for example, we are posting a new photo to Airless B&B. You are someone who is trying to list your space station on the website, and so you go and you want to upload half a dozen pictures. Well, the way this is working right now is you send a post request to the app with a gigantic photo attached to it. And the app says, okay, cool, I'm going to receive that request in the controller. I'm going to take all this binary image data that you sent me and I'm going to shove it over to S3. I'm going to open a network connection, push that file over to S3, wait however long that takes. Maybe it's 2 seconds, maybe it's 20. And then eventually, when that file is done running to S3, I will generate the response to send back to you, patient user, who has been waiting on this web request for like 20 seconds. One good example is SMS. That's another thing where if you're using Twilio, for example, to send SMSs, tons of people do this in line. Like, oh, I'm going to send my user an SMS to confirm their account. I'll just do that real quick as part of the create action. Well, that's another example of one that's bad. Doesn't seem like it might be as bad, but you might be surprised as to how long it takes to do that. And you might be doubly surprised when all of a sudden your Twilio calls that we're running in 50 milliseconds are all of a sudden taking 5,000 milliseconds because, hey, it's an external API and there's no guarantees on performance, right? Again, same pattern. Request comes in, controller sends it over to the SMS gateway, Twilio or whoever, and then finally generate the response. You need to move this stuff to a background worker. Who is familiar with background workers? Hopefully most of you are. Good. This should all be pretty straightforward then. Let's replace that call instead with just a bang version of it. And then let's wrap that into Rails 4's cool active job functionality. Let's just shove that in a queue to do later. Now what happens is we move from this model of request going to controller, which then sends it out to some external service to response, to this model, which allows us to say, okay, request, send it to the controller, spin off that SMS thing to finish later because, okay, if they have to wait 2 seconds, whatever, that's fine. But go ahead and immediately generate a response to that request. The code for that is super simple and pretty straightforward. Questions on backgrounding things? Most of you probably have done this in Sidekick or Rescue or something directly. It is possible now to do that through blessed built-in Rails things if you want.
By the way, the more common example is also mailers.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is a lot more common in all the Rails apps that also could be affected by the same thing.
Totally, yeah.
Is that similar to, like I've used delayed jobs before, and I think that's sort of a similar concept. We would like,
Yes.
we use it for like form submissions and.
Totally, yes. Delayed job is an example of doing that. Now, this is, if I'd had another day to work on this talk, this would be number 11, which is delayed job. I had a slide in my last talk. I say this not to call you out at all. I'm totally not you, but being at Heroku and being in database support, this is one thing where I feel like I kind of have a unique perspective on this. Delayed job is awesome for getting stuff out of web requests. That's great. As it turns out, using your database as the queuing library works great until it suddenly doesn't work great, and brings everything down in a smoldering heap. Because what happens is, when you use delayed job, every time you queue a job, that writes a record to a database table. Every time you dequeue a job, that reads that record from the database table, locks it, writes it back. That's fine when you're running in, a relatively quiet production environment. But when all of a sudden you're processing like thousands of these jobs every few seconds, it turns out the vast majority of your database traffic becomes reads and writes from your delayed jobs table. I have seen more than a handful of production apps that are spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars more on databases every month because they run delayed job, and delayed job itself is using something like 40 or 50% of the database's total available resources. And it gets even more complicated than that because there are follow-on effects with the way Postgres is caching data and stuff like that. But long story short, nowadays you can move to something like Rescue or Sidekick, or even if you're you can use active jobs, swap out the backend, whatever. But use something like Redis for the actual queuing of jobs. Like, yeah, the jobs are still going to interact with the database. That's fine. But in terms of tracking jobs to be done and who's doing those jobs, moving to something like Redis will make an immense difference if you're running at pretty large scale in production. Any questions on that? Because that's a bonus freebie.
There's a caveat to that, because you might lose your jobs if the Redis server goes down because it's an in-memory database. So
right, yeah.
So if
you're running a Redis without persistence, yeah.
Yeah. So if you care about that, that might be the caveat.
Yeah.
To that.
It's totally one of those things where it's easy for me to sit up here on stage like a big dumb idiot and tell you, hey, just throw the switch and kick it over to Redis. Like, yeah, there are totally caveats, and you should absolutely try it out. But that is one thing to be aware of. If you're running Redis, and like on Heroku, for example, our cheapo free Redis, there is no persistence. So if you kill the Redis or it fails over or something, you might lose some jobs that are in process. But there are ways to run it where, if you're running Redis that is flushing to disk, there are ways to protect against that sort of thing. But it absolutely is something you should be aware of. Thank you for calling that out. Yes?
I'm just curious, what does active job use as the queue by default?
Richard, do you have the answer to that?
It uses an in-memory queue, so it basically just spins up another thread and runs it in another thread. But that's not persistent. Like if your app just shuts down, then you lose the job. So it's fine for development. But you definitely want something else in production.
And you can configure it as a wrapper for some of the other backends, right?
Yeah. I mean, the idea is it's the same interface no matter what the backend is.
Okay.
So you write it in development, and you can use the threaded thing, and that's fine. But then you can just switch it over and be like, hey, use Sidekick now, or switch it over and be like, hey, use delayed job or rescue. I guess there's maybe
Yeah, I think there are a few different backends.
Yeah.
I get the sense that it's sort of I would roughly equate it to using, and Richard, tell me if I'm way off base here, but I would roughly equate it to using Active Record versus using some of the specific features of your database directly, in the sense that when I've done basic stuff with Rescue and Sidekick, the interface is largely the same idea, right? You queue a job, you dequeue it by its ID, you look up the stuff through the job, right? It's you can, if you're just doing the basics, you can swap in something like Sidekick or Rescue pretty easily. But if you're using super advanced features of Sidekick, it's not super practical to switch that over to Rescue. And much in the same way, if all of your database interaction is happening through Active Record, it's a lot cheaper for you to switch from MySQL to Postgres or something. When you compare that to if you've written an app that is using a whole bunch of super specific Postgres things, you can't just pick up and port that to something else. Kind of the same idea, where it's if you're using the core 80% of the functionality, you can use something like Active Job and just swap out backends all day long.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions on that stuff? Thank you for giving me a chance to rant about one of my favorite hobby horses. Fun stuff. So now that's it. We've solved all the problems. Now all it's left to do, one more problem. Yes, question in the back.
Quick question, your original design had photos to create, and you had a photo uploading. You can't really put a photo in job queue, can you? Or do you just, what solution there? Because you still have to upload the file, are you going to go straight to S3 or what?
Yes, that is an excellent question. And the typical, so this is trickier on Heroku than it is on other places. If you're running your own server, depending on your concurrency, you might decide that there are some cases where you're okay just posting a file directly to your app, knowing that request is going to run real slow. As long as you're watching it, and you know that the rest of your app can handle it or whatever, that's fine. With Heroku, most of the time what we recommend that you do is, and it gets a little convoluted, but there's enough examples out there that it's not that bad, but you essentially use Ajax to put a file directly onto S3, and the libraries that enable you to do that will then give you back essentially a token that you can use, and in your actual post request to your app, you say, hey, I'd like to create a file, please, and I already uploaded it to S3, and here's like the one-time use URL for where the temporary file is. And then your app will take that request, say, all right, cool, I will take care of this. Once I get off this call, your call is very important to us. I'm going to just tell you that I'm going to finish it eventually, and go do this later. And then in a background worker, you go fetch that file from the temporary bucket in S3, do your processing on it, and then shove it into its permanent home, where the actual model object, where like Paperclip, for example, knows now, okay, it's in the proper bucket for long-term storage in S3. It's kind of convoluted, but once you work through it and kind of understand how all the pieces fit together, you see how it's actually a pretty graceful solution to the problem, and it makes a lot more sense. Does that explanation kind of make sense, hopefully? Cool, great. So yeah, long story short, most of these things, some of them you might have learned the hard way. Hopefully this will prevent you maybe from learning one or two of these the hard way. I know I have. That's it. Any other questions? Go for it.
Yeah, can you talk about the tiered structure, tiered structure support at Heroku? So like, do you have some like enterprise plan where somebody like literally emails you like, my site is slow, and you're like, okay, let me look through your source code, bad, like, or like, how do you help people?
Yes, I will. I will certainly. I can certainly opine on this at length afterward or during the break. But I will just give a very brief spiel and say we have a lot of very qualified people on the support team that answer tickets directly. We do mostly try to kind of stay out of customer app specifics where we can. Obviously, given the content of this, like this talk was all based on enough Heroku have seen enough code and enough customer apps to know that these are the common things. So like a lot of the sort of common stuff, we will, we will see and give you like kind of the default answer for, oh, we've seen enough of this that we know to go look for this, and in 5 minutes we can find most of these things. We do have a couple of offerings above traditional support. We have, there's premium support, which is you can pay a fee every month, and that gets you the ability to open an urgent ticket that pages somebody like me, who I am, phone's over there, which is good because I'm second on call right now for support. So if you had premium support and you open an urgent ticket, then me or one of my colleagues would get paged to essentially work with you immediately. On top of that, we also, if you go to like some of our enterprise plans and get some bigger contracts and stuff, we have a group of people called Customer Solution Architects, CSAs, that are people that have experience building apps and running things on Heroku that will get down and dirty with you and understand what problems your app might be having, architecturally what you might need to do, work really closely with you, like a dedicated, essentially account manager, but like a technical account manager, which is what they used to call the team. I don't know why they changed it, but someone whose job it is to understand understand your app and help you solve problems at that kind of lower level. But I'm happy to talk about that more after the fact if you want.
Yeah. So I also do support tickets. Basically, it's like if the support, our general support queue has a Ruby question that they can't answer, then it gets escalated up to me. And I find if you have a very focused, very specific question, like you've already done your homework, you've already looked at this presentation and you're like, hey, one of your employees recommended I do blank, and I did that, and I got some slightly unexpected, results. Then if it's clear that you've done your homework, then they'll give you the time of day, and they'll help you out a little bit, but maybe not necessarily go into your source code and be like, change this line to make this thing. It also kind of depends on your whole scale and what we are also interested in as a platform. All of that memory tooling, the only reason that exists is because we had a bunch of large customers open up tickets and be like, hey, how do we debug memory on Heroku? Just the blanket question, period. And I was like, you don't, because tooling doesn't really exist. Let me go out and write a bunch.
We should probably have some tooling for that, yeah.
Yeah, and then I worked with them to get them to test it, and so that doesn't necessarily happen every day
where you get somebody writing you custom tooling for the platform, but you know, like we're definitely interested in helping.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like the way I would describe it is that in general, Heroku support exists to ensure that our platform is working correctly and that you can use all the features of our platform to the fullest extent of the law. But there are definitely times when things kind of tiptoe into application spheres where somebody like Richard is still happy to jump in and work on it. And also that's where like I said, the CSAs come in there too. More questions?
I had
Yes.
a comment about the N+1 thing that you mentioned.
Yes.
You talked about it from the read perspective, but there's also the flip side of it, which is from the create. You can also run into problems where you create a bulk set of records, but you do that through a loop, for example, and you create each one of them at a time.
Sure.
And Rails doesn't give you something out of the box for that. There are a few things, but there's also a gem for like bulk insert that you can use.
Yeah.
So that's something that I've been doing for the past couple of months.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, that absolutely can be a thing. In general, and that's one place where ORMs in general can be kind of tricky sometimes, because you would hope that, you know, Rails would give you a way to cleanly do that. And, you know, like we saw up here in the case of doing reads, it does. And, you know, to be fair, most of the time, like, you know, most apps we run on the web are mostly read traffic anyway. But it absolutely can be the case where, especially if you're doing a ton of them, that, you know, you could massively improve the response time for a write query by doing things in a single query instead of, like you said, getting an N+1 in a write loop.
Usually when people have an import function or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Yeah.
A bunch of records.
Yep. Cool. Yeah, thank you for calling that out. I appreciate that. Cool. Any other questions, thoughts? Wonderful. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much. You already clapped, so that was good. Okay, we have a 10-minute break. That's normally about right. We still have some pizza left. It might be a little cold. It's right by Caleb. Wave hi, Caleb. Everybody turn around and look at Caleb. Also, we also do this thing called like hiring and looking. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're looking for a job. Also, if you are hiring, and then if you would all of you please come up and like congregate in this area, and then exchange business cards if those were still a thing, or email addresses, whatever you people do. Who's looking for a job? Okay, keep okay, everybody look around. Good. Okay, who's hiring? All right. We're like pretty evenly matched. That's pretty good. So it is currently 10 after. Let's shoot for 20 after, and then we're gonna kick it off with another talk. Cool. And break.
We're so close to being on time.
By the way, everything you said is stuff that I've been working with anyone.
Nice.
Like, so it's like, yeah, see that one? Yep, that one.
Isolate ourselves.
In most cases, like we have seen.
How about yourself?
We have maybe already seen 6 of those, and then like 2 of them, whatever. 2 of them, like 6 months from now, we'll be pushing something out in production again. Like, just remember that one. Thought forever ago.
So me, it was, inheriting an old app, and then looking after the fact through, how's it going? After the fact. It used to be a bypass app. All right. Switching to
You've done a lot of
so, yeah.
Okay. JavaScript,
and then have to do it, and then I'll have a branch that's fixed, that's fixed on it, and then I'll have another branch that's not fixed, and then I'll have to do the same work. Yeah, do both of them ready, and then merge that branch. So I have to do the same work over and over again.
We had a similar emoji problem recently where, because I work on a tool right now that's synchronizing like Salesforce forms. So if you're a company that uses Salesforce, you want to synchronize it to the Postgres database. Yeah. You know, just like query directly and run a web app. We have a tool that does that called Connect. I support that. Did you notice that Connect was soundly stripping emoji out? So if you like wrote, if you have like a Postgres field with some text in the database, and you write some text in it, put a few emoji in there, when you round trip to like sync things on the back, the emoji will be gone. And we realized later that because we used the super old soap API in Salesforce, XML 1.0, which only uses CTF, is not going to hold the emoji. So it's like, well, now we have to say that kind of just, and it's like, we're not going to change that. That's down in the guts enough. Sorry,
it's a very similar syntax as website. So if you're I think I've done it.
There were 0 other
that's not your
Yeah, so we basically need higher hands right now to complete out this
What's that? Kind of pissed. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, at some point, either that or you'd be like 30 and still like hanging out at my house. Yeah, absolutely. Like never having friends. Like never oh wow. I guess we could be like, yeah. Now we're like, oh, college. Then he came around the job.
What's that? 2. About 2 years, yeah. Yeah, I knew I wanted to work in tech. No tech advice. Came from more business design.
But I did see all
yeah, exactly. Now, I've been spending the last 6 years doing a lot of technical.
When we're on the record server, start running
So
that
what's
Rails
a little bit different about us is like,
in the context of
whenever I touch the
I need to show you this slide. I felt so terrible, like, being like, jumped all over it. But I need to show you, I want to talk about not my baby. I have a slide. Just to prove that was
Yeah, we've had we're moving around. It's experience, yes, made the secret. Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. A lot of people build prototypes, semi-technical founders build prototypes in Rails, and then, all right, the Saffron, so here we go. Coding boot camps, yeah, I've found that starting to go away. So I know a lot of the camps are teaching I know General Assembly, well yeah, it's not me. The new me stack, Mongo, Postgres, Angular.
It's like, oh no, just believe in our source code. It's like, oh no.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's like, oh, this company uploaded a bunch of files.
Hey man, what's up? Is it you're looking here? Okay, we're hiring.
Okay, right on.
Tell me what you want to do.
So, you know, I do primarily Rails. Well, because I have you've been deleting that for like, they are uploading for 2.5 years. I don't.
Oh yeah, like go for it.
all of the
Yeah, so
all of these workers have to
All right, so you mostly like do Rails. What are the parts of the
all of your workers come along and they're trying to find the first row of stuff this table where it didn't work.
Tell me about yourself. What do you want?
So I was really comfortable with more front end.
The realization that
I got away from that long.
it was kind of the first one to really
I worked on
the next one that came out was actually and it's the big thing that changed was that instead of using Postgres in your database for the job queue, it uses and so basically
no, I know I've written
so all the connect to Reddit, and then but it's still exactly the database.
I just have never been in a situation where it's like,
That's kind of the main difference.
No, I really don't have.
How familiar are you with Youssef?
Okay. Yeah.
So the big difference
just got on a Techstars. We were at Capital Factory before, man.
And then I wanted to okay.
One, like it is meaning it's literally one
I'm a product operations.
there are a couple
I saw you guys.
Can you all start to find your seats?
Oh yeah. I just got
Yeah, we're doing
we'll send you studies. Yes. Yeah.
We should ping her. Maybe she found out there's no drinks. Alright, yeah.
You ready? You excited? You stoked? Okay, thank you all very much for following instructions. I don't know, I just started off with thank you, and I didn't really have anywhere to go with that, so. I mean, you get what you pay for, right? Okay, so next up we've got Youssef, and you're going to be talking about script organization with Thor and Rake. I totally just read that off the slides. You can also do CLIs, and like Rake is one of those things that's pretty integral into the Ruby ecosystem, so you should be pretty jazzed to hear all about it.
Woo! Thank you.
Sorry, my hand said pizza in a wrong clap.
All right, so like Mr. Schneems over there said, we're talking a little bit about how to interact with your client and command line while you're working in your Rails application. So usually that involves Rake or Thor. Just a little bit about me before I start. So I recently, in August 2015, started my own agency, Bear and Giraffe. I'm the bear. So I've been doing web development all my career, Ruby on Rails since 2008. We do the giraffe part is the design. That's my wife. You've probably seen.
Tall?
Yeah. So, so yeah, we do consulting, and we're actually I'm looking for work for starting July. So, if you're hiring a consultant or contractor, let me know. So let's start. Usually, you're probably familiar with these two commands. That's very standard when you're starting with a Rails application. You'll probably run a generator like Rails generate model user, or you'll probably run some test. I hope you've run tests by running Rake test. But the question is, where do these things come from, right? So let's take a look at a little bit more examples. So if you run rake-t, you'll get a list of all the tasks that are available for you. You're familiar with the DB one probably, to create, drop, migrate, etc., and test. But where do they come from, right? So a lot of people think that everything about Rails is magic. I hate that. I really hate that part. It's not really magic. Everything is very clear. That actually, in my opinion, that a lot of these things are super simple and clear in Rails. So let's take a look at how they happen. Obviously, first we need to talk about Rake because that's very common. But before I do, we definitely need to recognize Jim, who is the creator of Rake. Sadly, Jim passed away, but if you don't know who Jim is, please search his name on Confreaks. I don't know him personally, but I wish I did, just based off his talks that he's given. They're very amazing. Rake, from the name, should be familiar to those of you who've done computer science or maybe C before. From the GitHub repo, Rake is defined as the make-like program implemented in Ruby. Tasks and dependencies are specified in standard Ruby syntax. Well, if you know what make is, that makes sense to you. If you don't, well, what is make, right? Make, according to its definition, is a tool which controls the generation of executables and other non-source files of a program from the program source file. Does that sound familiar to any of you in the Rails world? You know, Rails application? Generation of executables? Probably not, right? Rake test and Rake DB are probably not generating executables for you. So I guess the keyword there is a make-like program, right? So let's take a look a little bit more about make. Make gets its knowledge of how to build your program from a file called the make file, which lists each of the non-source files and how to compute it from other files. I think you can read the rest of it. All right, so since Rake is make by taking the M and substituting it for the R, let's do a little bit of the same. All right, and we get this. So Rake gets its knowledge to how to build your program from a file called Rake file, etc., etc., etc. Let's start eliminating some things and replacing them. Maybe we'll get closer. So instead of building, we are running a program. Instead of a program, we're running scripts. tasks, run instead of install, script. Okay, maybe we're getting closer now. I guess so. Let's take a look. Let's find out. Okay, so luckily Rails does that for us, and you know, they got some things figured out, and they do some of these things for us on our behalf. So let's take a look. I'm going back this way. So if we generate a new Rails application, we ignore this for a little bit. You'll notice that there's a file called Rake file. That should be familiar because we just talked about it, and you know, it said something about a Rake file. It's not very comprehensive, but it requires a few things like your config from the application, and then calls a function in Rails that loads tasks. I'm not going to go deep into this. There's a talk by Nicholas, I can't remember his name, from RailsConf, and he talks about the boot process of Rails, and he goes into detail about how it happens. But basically, all you need to know from this is that Rails does load some. It basically loads the path from where it expects the Rake files to exist, the build scripts, as we've called them before. And basically, in Rails application, it expects them to be in lib, and then under the folder called tasks, and any file that has the .rake extension is pretty much going to be loaded automatically for us by Rails, right? So let's take a look at how we work with Rails a little bit here. So how do we define a task? Okay, that should be Rake task, not take task, but okay. First, you start with a namespace. Usually, it's a good idea to start with a namespace so that you don't conflict with other people's commands and tasks. No, I don't want to enable dictation here. Okay, let's start this again. There we go. All right, so after you've specified your namespace, you add a description because you're nice to other developers and you want to tell them what this thing is supposed to do, and you're not meanie. And then description with the keyword this, and then the string, and then task, and then the name of your task. Pretty simple, right? So next, since I'm in a Rails application, I should be able to load my Rails environment and do something that is related to my Rails app, right? So I need to be able to load my environment. That's very easy with Rake and Rails because all you have to do is provide the keyword here, environment. So that's the new Ruby syntax where the colon is after. So if you've probably seen it with the hash rocket, that's the similar syntax, right? So now that that's there, we need to take a look at a real-world example. So let's say that I am running an application that has strong component in the front end part, and I want to also test my JS because it's very easy if you start a new Rails application with mini test, you run Rake test, but that only tests your Ruby. But what if I want to integrate into my build process something that runs my JavaScript test as well? And this here is the first time I've used the word build process, right? But so let's think about it. If we're deploying it to Heroku, for example, or any other provider, or Kubernetes, Docker, whatever that you're doing, you have some set of tasks that you define for that build process. And we've seen some of them were the compilation of the assets, running the test, and now we want to integrate tests for our JavaScript. So let's take a look at how we can do that. And for this, I'm going to try All right, so I'm requiring colorize. That's a gem that helps you easily add colors to your outputs. Not very important for this. I'm requiring a JS hint / lint. And if you're looking at my folders right here, you'll see this right there. I'll talk about it in a second. But that's a lib file that I've I've created for this talk. So define the namespace test. Now, this namespace already exists because you already have the Rake test. And what I want to do is add on top of that. So defining the namespace test and then adding a task that is full. And what I'm saying here is I want full to run other tasks, right? So it's basically because Rake is a build specification, right? You're telling it what task you want it to run. So we already have tests by default, and I'm adding a new task here that's called test JS hint. And then I'm going to define JS hint below. So like I said, JS hint is going to run my JavaScript test, and basically what I've done is extract everything out into a lib file, which we'll talk about in a second, but I'm initializing a new linter, and I'm calling lint on it, and then if it runs a few things, and we'll see what those are, and if it has error, it will tell us that it failed, and we'll exit false because I want it to break. I want it to tell me that the build failed. Otherwise, I will just say test all passed, and everything's green, all good, right? So that should be clear. Any questions about this so far? Anyone? Okay. So let's take a quick look at what JSLint does. Actually, can I just expand this, please? Never mind. So I have part of this is, you'll probably see them are the node modules over there. I have node inside this Rails application. I'm not going to go through the details of that. That's easy to do. But I've taken a little bit here of a script that probably should be packaged into its own gem, but I'm using it here myself for this talk. And basically, it does a few things, which loads a config file, which are under the config directory of the Rails application. In there, I have a few flags that I will give to to lint to specify if I should look for semicolons and all those things and use strict mode, etc., etc. So I'm loading the configuration in my initialize, and then I'm running the lint process by really calling this the system command over here, which calls the JS hint node module on my JavaScript files. So that's a little bit of detail, but I wanted to show this because it's important to see how we can organize your scripts, even if you're running a Rake task, by using the directory structure that Rails already gives you, by including things in your lib folder if you need them, or otherwise other places depending on what your requirement is. And I say this because I see a lot of people who will put everything inside the Rake task, every single thing that's logic need, because they think that this is a scripting tool and everything in from my script needs to be there. But we shouldn't forget that Ruby is very good in object-oriented programming, and we should leverage that. So this is why I'm going through this a little bit here. So that's that. So that should go back to here. All right. So if we do typing with one hand, Rake-T. All right, so like we said before, Rake-T will load your all your tasks that are available. With AOR, you're giving it basically just limit the number of tasks that match that string, like running pipe grab. So we can see here I have my my two Rake tasks that we defined earlier, and if I do test, you can see that the test full is a test that we've added, and that's now available here. So we can run it and see what happens. Hopefully I didn't do anything that will break the app. You know, because I thought the talk was last week, and then I went around and messed with the app. Oh wait, it worked. Basically, I had these outputs in my file, and then I don't know. Let's see here, and do I have it? Oh right, so never mind. I didn't put an actual spec, but you know, I got an asset that it did run. It will fail. Failed. And basically because in my JS hint, I tell it that you should only use single quotes instead of double quotes because that's best practice, etc. So that worked. Let's go back to the presentation. You can do this. All right, so this was a very simple example, in my opinion, at least, and very common because if you Google how to create your own Rake task, you'll see a lot of these examples out there. But what about a little bit more complex example, something that is more involved, let's say like a more involved build process that will do a lot of things depending on some flags that you give it. And usually when you're familiar with command line executables, like let's say Rails generate model and then you're giving it a parameter, right? So you're giving it an option, you're giving it a parameter, like Rails new -t for the test or to skip the test, etc. So how do you give Rake these types of parameters? Well, now this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So there are apparently 4 ways to pass arguments to Rake. You can read more about that in this this URL, but I'll go through basically the content of that here for you. Method 1, the Rake way. Apparently there are names for these things also. You can see from the red part, you specify in brackets as an array the arguments that you want to pass Rake. And you do that after you've defined the name of the task. And then you capture it in the blog as the word args, and then you can access your parameter this way. Sounds okay this up until here, until you try to run it, and then you have to pass in the parameters as a bracket, as an array to the command. And it's very easy to confuse that, and it's not really what you're used to. But also, if you run ZSH like I do, you'll have to escape the brackets.
Nice.
Now, that's very annoying. I don't like that at all. So let's try another way. There's the environment variables way. We've already seen it when setting up the environment variables for Heroku or your deployment. You can probably, environment variables is not just a deployment thing. You can use it in any type of scripting that you do, and in Ruby as well. And you can basically tell your shell that I have this environment variable and this one over here, and then Ruby will know how to access these things by running this, by accessing the env hash. I don't like that either. It's okay, but it's not very very scripty in my opinion. So let's look at another example. There's the argv example, which starts going out into sort of more complicated scripting, hacking or magic that you need to do by faking Rake, because Rake basically accepts multiple tasks that you can run at once. So if you do Rake add, multiply, divide, whatever, it will run all these commands. So if you do Rake add 1, 2, it tries to run the command 1 and the command 2. But that's not what you want. You want to pass those in as variables. So what you do is you take these things that it expects as commands, and you tell it, oh, don't use them as command. Instead, use them as args instead. So also a little bit of work that you have to do here in order to get something that's more reasonable on the command side. That's also, depending on what you do, that could work. There's also the fourth method. Ruby provides you with there's always a gem for that. So you've got outparse where you can have it parse options, but also you need to do a little bit more of plumbing beforehand. So you're telling you're passing on the options, what type of options that it expects, which is very typical and usual. But also then you find out that you need to pass these dash over here so that Rake can escape, can just understand that this is where the command ends and these are where the parameters start. So those are all the 4 ways that Rake accepts parameters into your scripts. I'm just going to leave it there.
I agree.
I thought you were going to have a 5th way of like, okay, this is going to change our life now.
There is. We saw the way the Rake tasks work, but we've also seen the way the Rails tasks work, right? So Rails generate model user. That's more of what we're looking for, and that's what we're used to. So what does Rails use, and what does Bundler use? What does Vagrant use, which is another Ruby client gem? So obviously there's a gem for that, and that's my 5th method. Surprisingly, the fifth method is called Thor. And if you didn't know, Thor comes pre-bundled for you with Rails. So even though I say there's a gem for that, you don't actually have to install a new gem. It's already there with your Rails application. It's already there if you've used Bundler. It's already there if you've used Vagrant. So how does a Thor command look like? Well, it looks like this. So Thor, name of the command, your arguments, and then any other options that you want to pass on to it. That's a little bit more familiar to us if you've done any sorts of scripting with Bash, or even just running Rails commands like Rails generate or something else. So I think, in my opinion, this looks nicer than the other 4 options. So let's recap. So you've got Thor add 1, 2 versus Rake add brackets 1, 2, or Rake add num1 equal 1, num2 equal 2, or Rake add dash num1 1 dash num2 2. I'm lazy, I'll go with the first one. So let's take a look at how you can do the same thing in Thor, and let me switch back to Adam, which, by the way, I'm more of a Sublime Text person, but I'm forcing myself to use Adam just because I like to torture myself. All right. So same thing, let's start with how do you define a task. And in Thor, you start with a class and you inherit from Thor, right? So the same namespace that we've got there, but instead of calling namespace AOR, I'm starting a class called AOR. Come back, uncomment. No, I have to comment these out because when I want to run it, it'll freak out. But so now let's also do, let me make this parallel. So you'll see also to add a task, what you do inside your class, you add a description, and then you define a method called whatever your task you want to call it. So you can see the parallel here, right? So pretty similar so far. right, so now you're noticing that it got a little bit more complicated on the Thor side. So we talked about adding an environment because you're in a Rails application, right? So sometimes you would need to include something like your models if you want to create something in a database or whatever. Because of the stuff that Rails does on the Rake side, that's very simple on the Rake side. On the Thor side, you'll have to do a little bit of work. Now, disclaimer, there's a gem for that too. But the gem is these 3 lines of code, so I'm just gonna put the 3 lines of code here myself. And basically, what it does is sets the Rails environment, and by default, we're working in development unless you specify it somewhere else. And then loads the environment.rb from your config, which then loads your environment, your specific environment settings and your application, all that kind of stuff. But really, that's all you need to do is define this method, which is 2 lines, and then include it in your task where you want your environment to be, or you can include it for all of your tasks if you need to. But that's a point where it's good to note that there's a tiny little bit more work to do on the Thor side than it is from the Rake side. So now let's take a look at okay, scroll. Actually, let me just do this. All right, fine. So there's a lot more text here, but I'll explain why. So let's do a real-world example here as well. If we have, let's say you are running a search somewhere, like a Solar instance that has a list of text that list of documents that you want to search on, right? But let's say that in development you want a list of stuff that you can list of queries that you can get from the search index, and you don't want to just do it manually. So you want to run a script that does that for you. So let's look at that real-world example here, and so I'm also including another lib file. So this is not the same linting example, but something a little bit more complex. But you can see here how easy it is to do it with Thor. So we've got the description, the short summary description above. Thor provides us a way to provide a long description, which is going to be very helpful because we can include examples in here as well. So in here we have example usage of our task, how we can run it with a lot of information, which is very friendly to your fellow developer. And basically I'm explaining what are the different options that are doing here. We can ignore that. And then by adding the tag option next to before the method, you can specify what are the different options that you want your task to take in, and you give them you can give them a name, obviously a type, which is very helpful because you will not have to convert anything from a boolean or array or something like that. That will do it for you. You can alias your option, which is good because you'll have a shorthand for each of them. So let's say this long form of this would be -- query. The short form would be just --query, and you can set defaults to it. So this is how you do that for this method. And then you pass in your arguments as regular arguments to a Ruby method, right? So nothing fancy here. This is very typical Ruby that you're probably familiar with from this block, right? So so you pass in the arguments, and then for all the options that you've divided above, you have this options variable here that is a hash that has all the options that the user provided to your script when they're running it. I'm not going to go through the details of the implementation, but basically what I have here is another Ruby class that takes in all this input, goes to Solar, fetches a bunch of random objects, and we can run it right now and see how it works. 1 second. So. All right, so the same way we have Rake-D, we have Thor list in order to list all the tasks that we have, and it separates them by the namespace like this. So if you have multiple classes or multiple namespaces, you have different blocks like this by themselves, and for each class you can define multiple methods with be multiple tasks for each namespace. And this one we have this, and it will show you the summary description right next to the task. And if you want to see the full description, you'll see the full description by just adding the -H for help next to the task. And then you see how here we've got all the descriptions that we've shown. So, and easy, just running it. Oops. Let me just type. Okay, yeah. So obviously it gives you good error messages if you miss something. What did I miss? Oh. Anyways, I don't have the, probably don't have the right URL. I'm not going to waste your time and look for it. But anyways, it works. Actually, let me see here. I would type history. There we go. No? Anyways. Wrong solar URL. But anyway, so it's pretty much the, you know, how you do it. So let's go back here. So this was a quick overview of everything. Now, to me, the Thor way feels a little bit more Ruby-like because of the classes and the methods. But I need to give a disclaimer that you can do classes and methods with Rake. It's a little bit more complicated, and there's not necessarily more complicated, but less common. So if you want to figure out how to do that, there's a good short video by Avdi Grimm. If you subscribe to Ruby Tapas, he did this a couple of weeks ago. Shows an example, but usually that if you're looking for something that some of the stuff that Rake provides you, like the dependency graph, that's a good way to look at. Rake gives you a lot of those things by default. But like you've seen, most of the ways that people will define the Rake task through those short scripts. If you are very dependent on the Rails environment, it's very easy to do it in Rails, in Rake, and with the Rails integration. But now, so basically the takeaway is that you have a couple of different options for you to use. One is not better than the other. In my opinion, they each do one thing very well. Although people do have the common mistake, I feel, that they use Rake as instead of Thor when they should use Thor, because they think of it as a strictly like scripting tool, when in fact it's a build tool. That's what it's intended to do. But just because it's Ruby, then you can make it do whatever you want it to do, because Ruby is good that way. You don't have to do any extra work if you're in a Rails application to just have something that runs in your command line. That's super easy in both cases, because Thor and Rake both come with your when you install Rails. And one thing I want to mention and highlight is that the structure matters. So that's why for me, I prefer the Thor method when it comes to some of these things, because the way the class is structured, the method is structured, it forces you to use that method. It forces you to stay in the OOP realm, which I think is a good thing. So those were an overview of these things. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can do with these tools. They're a lot more powerful, but that's enough for now, I think. Otherwise, please hire me. I'm looking for jobs. Do you have any questions, comments, concerns? Anyone?
If someone wants to hire you, how should they do it?
So Chaker everywhere on the web, pretty much. That's right there on the bottom. Youssef at bearandgiraffe.com is my email as well. And I have business cards for you if you want to talk to me afterwards. Yeah?
Why do you think Rails core continues to use Rake for some things and Thor for others instead of just choosing one?
That's a good question. I actually have no idea. I think part of it is, so some stuff like the asset pipeline, for example, will probably require more dependency. I mean, Memes will be able to talk more about that. But the idea is that some stuff, when you can have tasks that are dependent of other tasks and that they can run independently or together and stuff like that, Rake is very good with this. Because of exactly what it does is it's dependency management, basically, and figuring out what has been run already and not run it again. So one of the cool things about Rake, for example, is that you can tell it how to check for a timestamp. And if that timestamp has passed, it won't run. That means that task has run already and it won't run it again. So if you don't want to run the same thing twice, that has run. So let's say, for example, if you are doing a blog and you're using a Rake command to upload your blog posts to WordPress, I don't know, and you're using a timestamp of the file. So if the file has been updated, so from regular, you get the file information from your system. If the file has been updated and uploaded, and the timestamp on WordPress is newer than the newer or equal to the timestamp that you have on your file system, it won't re-upload that file again. And Rake is very friendly with that. That comes to you out of the box, and that's actually, I'm stealing that example from AFD. So if you take a look at that video, it's very handy for you to go more into details about what I just said. But that's there in Rake, and I think a lot of the tasks that are there for Rails, they're pretty much going to help you when you're deploying to production or to elsewhere, which are very similar to a build process. So that would be my answer.
Rake is implemented in Thor, so we need a lower level of
Louder, please.
Rake is implemented in Thor, and so when you need to go lower level, it makes sense to use Thor rather than Rake.
Yeah, I would say that the chaining for Rake, like if you need to do you can run Rake db :setup space db setup space db migrate or whatever, and each one of those might call the environment task, but it's smart enough to only run the environment task once. Versus with Thor, you can have some of the pretty Rails generate scaffold whatever, but if you were gonna run multiple of those in a row, I don't know, how would it know how to pass what arguments into what? And also with Rails 5, Rails is now actually an alias for Rake. You can run all of your Rake tasks through the Rails command, and it's smart enough to know how to do them. So you can run Rake test, Rails test.
Rails db migrate.
Rails db migrate. Yeah.
Cool. Although it'll be a little bit confusing because of the different syntax, but.
Well, I mean, it's manually ported over. It's all, yeah. It all works perfectly. It's Rails. Come on.
Any other questions? Beer time? Beer?
Cool. Are you gonna go to?
Yeah.
All right. So for those of you who joined us after. Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. We're gonna go to CU29. I think we need a little bit of help. If you have some trash, please throw it away. If you won the pizza raffle, which is all of you, and what do we do with the extra pizza?
Oh, we give it to Pepper Factory.
Oh, sorry. We are
want it.
taking that pizza.
No, I mean,
Yes.
if he ever wants it, like, that is pizza that is free.
Yes,
Go give it to Capital Factory.
we got you this pizza. Please, like, grab a box, drop it off in your car or something, and then meet us over at CU29. Thank you very much for coming.
Eat it with no hands, like an animal.
Always eat your pizza like
It's one of those things where I haven't really looked for an alternative for
Yeah.
I did. I wasn't happy with it.
I mean, it should do his 20-minute talk in only an hour.
That was good. A lot of audience participation.
Yeah, that was a good talk, thank you.
You probably already know more all of it.
Yeah, it was nice to be reminded.
A little refresher. I like to think that it's all stuff that, like, when you or I and everybody do that sort of thing in like 6 months from now, we like should do something. It'll at least like shorten the amount of time it takes to remember. Oh, that's what that is. No, I know how to go fix that.
Now we just need to get everybody
Just goods, man. Goods all day.
Yeah.
There's better than first class.
What's his name? Somebody has a request for getting primary keys to me.
You have to go quarterly.
Oh, they have to do that, not John. Somebody, Apple? Is that? He has a full request for getting primary keys to me. Big cereal by default. In Rake. Yeah. So people go there's actually apparently there's a number of reasons why people don't want to do UIDs as primary keys. Mostly, well, so yeah, I mean, and it's like even in the console, you're like, these are not fine.
Fine, use that last.
And some people will like squabble over space. Like it does technically take up a bit more space. I know, right? That was my response too. But yeah, even so, I think I would just use a big defaulting to like something that will not. Yeah. What? No, the database adapter works.
No, absolutely. Well, good luck.
Talk to Sean.
Not literally.
Hey, everyone can start clearing out.
Oh, yeah.
stood up here and the company just pitched it.
I'll walk down with you guys to grab the
Awesome. Oh yeah, dude. It's so cool being downtown. Place like this. Yeah, I thought like it's just downtown. Yeah, for me it's like, man.
Thanks, Zach.
Yes, sir.
It's in the fridge. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I can turn it back on.
No. This is what we're going to
Oh, I can turn it back on for an hour if you want. Okay.
Yes, sir. How many groups were there not? Just this big one here?
Oh, yeah.
I asked him how was his team, he said they're weather, and that's exactly right. And he started around about 4:35, he probably said.
Yeah, I was about to ride my bike over here. Like I brought it downstairs and everything, and I'm bored.
It was pouring, but it stopped pouring, it was just pouring, but you didn't know that though.
Yeah.
You didn't know how long